Now friends, we shall move on to indifference curve map. The entire utility function of an individual can be represented as an indifference curve map. Now in the figure 18 at page number 2.62, you have three indifference curve mark there, IC1, IC2 and IC3. Now the satisfaction level will be more in the case of IC3, little less in the case of IC2 and little less in the case of IC1. The utility, when they vary, the curve moves or the curve shifts. Like when there are three types of utility derived, there are three curves made there in the indifference curve. Like the combination of goods lying from the origin are preferred to those on indifference curve which are closer to the origin. Moving upward to the right from one indifference curve to the next represents an increase in the utility, and moving down and left represents an decrease in the utility. So here we have marked X and Y. On the Y-axis good Y, on X-axis you have the good X. Now there are various combinations in the IC1, IC2 and IC3. As you move on the IC1, the utility is the same, but for different quantity of good Y, different quantity of good X is to be taken up. When the curve shifts to IC2, it gives a various different combinations, and the greater the satisfactory level also. So this is what is called as indifference curve map. Now we go to marginal rate of substitution. What is it? It is the rate at which a consumer is preferred to have one good X instead of another Y, being the satisfaction level the same. That is, we are talking about movement of the consumer in the same curve, whereby he forgoes 1 unit of good X and ready to consume another unit of good Y. So the marginal rate of substitution along any segment of the indifference curve refers to the maximum rate at which the consumer is ready to exchange units of Y for units of X. The MRS, namely marginal rate of substitution, is at any point in an indifference curve is same. The absolute value is the same. That means the slope of the curve is the same. When it is measured at a point, it tells the maximum unit of 1. In case of the other, the consumer is willing to take. Now take the table number 8. We see the various combinations. That is the movement along with the indifference curve. For every unit extra of food, he is ready to forgo an unit of clothing. So thus, this MRS of X for Y, for any loss of clothing, he gets the happiness derived from the same unit of food that he is ready to consume. The same has been explained in the case of the figure 19. Here you could see the diminishing marginal rate of substitution. What is diminishing marginal rate of substitution? For the first unit, when he is ready to give 6 units of clothing to get 1 unit of food, in the next table you can see he is ready to have the same 1 more unit of food, but he is ready to forgo only 4 units of clothing now. So the difference is 2. Like the marginal rate goes on diminishing. That is what has been explained in this curve. At point number C, the consumer consumes a much larger quantity of food, but to which he is giving only a small quantity of clothing than at point A. This means The additional unit of food has given him only a lesser utility of than the first case. This is because of the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now moving down the indifference curve, reducing the consumption of clothing and increasing food consumption will produce two opposite effects on the consumer's total utility. Reduction in the total utility due to reduced consumption of clothing and increase in total utility due to higher food consumption has been seen in the case of the utility curve. In order to keep his levels of satisfaction constant, these two effects must exactly move on the curve, indifference curve. The principle of diminishing marginal rate of substitution thus explains you that more of goods Y a person consume in proportion to good X, the less he is willing to substitute for another unit. But when he starts consuming more and more of X, he is ready to give up only less and less unit of the other goods. That is what has been explained in this curve. There are two reasons for this to happen. Why? The want of a particular good is satiable so that when a consumer has more of it, his intensity of want for it decreases. That is, he likes it, but for every extra unit, his satisfaction level is not that higher as the first unit. When the consumer has more unit of food, the desire to consume more and more reduces or comes down for every additional unit. Next is, the units of two goods are not perfect substitutes. They are imperfect substitute. If they are perfect substitute, then the MRS should remain constant, because if they are equally substitute, foregoing of one may not induce the utility of the other, or he might be willing to use one quantity of X and with the same quantity of Y. But here they are imperfect substitute. That is the reason for this diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Change in the total utility to change in the clothing consumption can be explained as marginal utility of clothing into change in the quantity of clothing. Change in total utility due to change in food consumption is marginal utility of food into change in the quantity of food. Therefore, along the indifference curve, you get it as marginal utility curve into delta of the quantity of clothing consumption is equal to marginal utility of food into delta of the quantity of food, that is change in the quantity of food. Therefore, in the equation, we can say that along the difference curve, an additional unit of clothing divided by an additional quantity of food is equal to marginal utility of food, that is decreasing, divided by the marginal utility of the clothing. So, MRS is equal to MUX divided by MUY. That is the slope of the indifference curve. For 1 unit of the X to get more or Y to get more, he is willing to sacrifice lesser and lesser and lesser of the other units. So we move down on the right along with the indifference curve. Thus the indifference curves becomes flatter as he comes down and down. Now the property